August 3, 1942. Office of the Undersecretary of the Treasury, Washington, D.C. Lieutenant Colonel Kenneth D. Nichols, Deputy District Engineer of the newly formed Manhattan Engineer District, sat across from Undersecretary of the Treasury Daniel W. Bell with an unusual request. The 34-year-old engineer needed to borrow something from the United States government, something valuable enough to build an atomic bomb. "How much do you need?" Bell asked. 6,000 tons, Nichols replied. Bell paused. "How many troy ounces is that?" Nichols, a West Point graduate trained in engineering rather than precious metal accounting, admitted he didn't know. Neither did Bell. Growing impatient with the semantic confusion, Nichols responded with characteristic military directness. "I don't know how many troy ounces we need, but I know I need 6,000 tons. That is a definite quantity. What difference does it make how we express the quantity?" Bell's reply came sharply. "Young man, you may think of silver in tons, but the Treasury will always think of silver in troy ounces." With their contrasting perspectives expressed, they settled on a form of agreement. Over the next months, the Manhattan Project would borrow not 6,000 tons, but 14,700 tons of silver from United States Treasury vaults, approximately 395 million troy ounces, worth roughly $16 billion at today's prices. This is the documented story of how America's most secret wartime project, facing a critical copper shortage, borrowed nearly the entire U.S. silver reserve to build the machines that produced the uranium for Hiroshima, and how those Calutron girls operating equipment they didn't understand helped win World War II. When Lieutenant Colonel Kenneth Nichols first calculated the copper requirements for the electromagnetic isotope separation process in mid-1942, the number was staggering. 5,000 short tons, that's 4,500 metric tons, of pure copper needed for the magnet coils alone. Under normal circumstances, obtaining copper wouldn't have been problematic, but 1942 was anything but normal. Copper was critically scarce throughout American industry. The War Production Board had allocated virtually every pound of domestic copper production to essential military uses: electrical wiring for ships and aircraft, shell casings for ammunition, communications wire for field operations, radiators for tanks and vehicles. The United States produced approximately 1 million tons of copper annually in the early 1940s, supplemented by imports from Chile and other sources. But wartime demand exceeded 1.5 million tons. Every industry competed for insufficient supply. Priorities were ruthlessly enforced. The Manhattan Engineer District, the secret organization tasked with building atomic weapons, had the highest priority rating possible: AAA. In theory, this meant they could requisition anything needed. In practice, even AAA priority couldn't conjure copper that didn't exist. Colonel James C. Marshall, the district engineer, and his deputy, Kenneth Nichols, discovered this reality when they approached the War Production Board about copper allocation for the Y-12 electromagnetic separation plant planned for Oak Ridge, Tennessee. The answer was clear: no copper available. Find an alternative. Nichols and his team reviewed the periodic table looking for alternatives. Copper's exceptional electrical conductivity, second only to silver among all metals, made it ideal for electromagnet windings. The massive Calutron magnets would carry enormous electrical currents, generating intense magnetic fields needed to separate uranium isotopes. Silver, with 6% higher conductivity than copper, would actually work better. The substitution ratio was favorable. 1.1 pounds of silver provided equivalent electrical performance to 1 pound of copper. In practical terms, 5,000 tons of copper could be replaced by approximately 5,500 tons of silver. But where would they obtain thousands of tons of silver? The answer lay in the basement of the United States Bullion Depository at West Point, New York, where the Treasury Department stored the National Silver Reserve. These weren't the famous gold reserves at Fort Knox, Kentucky. This was the silver backing America's currency, accumulated through decades of mining, trade, and monetary policy. Before 1942, suggesting that the government lend out its monetary silver for an industrial project would have been unthinkable. But the Manhattan Project operated under unique authority. On December 28, 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt had authorized unlimited resources for atomic weapons development. If they needed silver, they would get silver. The logistics, however, required delicate negotiation. The August 3, 1942 meeting between Nichols and Undersecretary Bell has become legendary in Manhattan Project history, preserved in Nichols' memoir The Road to Trinity and various historical accounts. The exchange over measurement units, tons versus troy ounces, wasn't mere bureaucratic pedantry. It reflected fundamentally different perspectives on what silver represented. To Nichols, silver was an electrical conductor, a material to be measured by weight like any other industrial input. To Bell and the Treasury Department, silver was money, the financial backing of U.S. currency, measured in the traditional unit of precious metals, troy ounces. A troy ounce equals 480 grains compared to a common avoirdupois ounce at 437.5 grains. The distinction mattered when discussing quantities worth billions of dollars. The agreement they reached was remarkably straightforward. The Treasury would lend silver to the Manhattan Engineer District, measured in fine troy ounces, accounting for purity, for the duration of the wartime emergency. The silver would remain Treasury property. Every ounce would be accounted for, tracked, and eventually returned. The paperwork didn't specify what the silver would be used for. That remained classified. Even Treasury officials handling the transfer weren't told they were enabling atomic weapons development. The forms simply authorized emergency wartime industrial use. The first shipment of silver bullion departed West Point Bullion Depository in October 1942. Life magazine published a photograph of silver bars being loaded, reporting vaguely that precious metals were being collected for an unspecified wartime industrial use. The destination, Defense Plant Corporation facility in Carteret, New Jersey, where the 1,000 troy-ounce silver bars would be recast into cylindrical billets suitable for processing. From Carteret, the silver traveled secretly across New Jersey to the Phelps Dodge copper plant at Bayway, where specialized rolling mills transformed the cylindrical billets into flat strips, 5/8 inch thick, 3 inches wide, and 40 feet long. These silver strips then journeyed to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, to the Allis-Chalmers Company, one of America's largest electrical equipment manufacturers. Here, the real magic happened. Allis-Chalmers workers wound the silver strips with wooden insulation around giant steel spools, creating electromagnet coils of unprecedented size and power. Each completed magnet unit measured 19 square feet and weighed several tons. The coils were then encased in protective steel housings for shipment. The manufacturing process was extraordinary. Workers handled silver worth millions of dollars as if it were ordinary industrial material, because in this context, it was. What mattered wasn't the silver's monetary value, but its electrical conductivity. At Y12 in Oak Ridge, workers would drill holes in the silver strips to assemble them into magnet cores. This drilling was performed over paper to catch every silver shaving. The collected dust would be weighed, accounted for, and eventually returned to the Treasury. No silver was lost or stolen from Y12, despite the fortune in precious metal stored in chain-link fenced areas, a testament to both security measures and the dedication of workers who understood without knowing specifics that they were handling something critical to the war effort. While silver journeyed from West Point to Milwaukee to Tennessee, an entire city was being built from nothing in the hills west of Knoxville. On September 19, 1942, General Leslie Groves, newly appointed commander of the Manhattan Engineer District, approved acquisition of 59,000 acres along the Clinch River. The site, initially called Site X and later the Clinton Engineer Works, would become Oak Ridge. The location offered multiple advantages: proximity to TVA electrical power, access to water from the Clinch River, relative isolation for security, and railroad connections for transporting materials and products. Original plans anticipated housing approximately 13,000 people. By war's end, Oak Ridge would be home to over 75,000 residents, making it the fifth largest city in Tennessee, a city that didn't officially exist. Construction began immediately. 4 major facilities would occupy separate valleys. Y-12, the electromagnetic separation plant, using calutrons powered by silver-wound magnets. K-25, the gaseous diffusion plant, the largest building in the world at the time. S-50, the liquid thermal diffusion plant, built in record time, 69 days. And X-10, the experimental plutonium pile and separation facilities. The construction logistics were staggering. Railroad cars poured in, 2,157 carloads of electrical equipment, 1,219 of heavy equipment, 5,389 of lumber, 1,407 of pipe and fittings, 1,188 of steel, 257 of valves, and 11 of welding electrodes. The Y-12 plant alone required 85,000 vacuum tubes, nearly the entire annual production capacity of the U.S. vacuum tube industry. Oak Ridge residents were easy to spot when they ventured into Knoxville. The hastily constructed secret city was blanketed in thick mud year-round. Muddy shoes became the telltale sign of someone from behind the fence. The technology that would consume 14,700 tons of silver originated in Berkeley, California, in the laboratory of Ernest Orlando Lawrence. Lawrence had won the 1939 Nobel Prize in Physics for inventing the cyclotron, a device using magnetic fields to accelerate particles in a spiral path. His insight in 1941 was that a modified cyclotron could separate uranium isotopes by mass. Natural uranium consists of 99.3% uranium-238 and only 0.7% uranium-235. But U-235 is the fissile isotope, the one that undergoes nuclear fission when struck by neutrons. An atomic bomb required U-235 enriched to 80% or higher purity. Lawrence's electromagnetic separation process worked elegantly in principle. 1. Vaporize uranium tetrachloride with heat, creating positively charged ions. 2. Accelerate ions through an electric field. 3. Bend the ion stream with an intense magnetic field. 4. Separate trajectories. U-238, slightly heavier, makes a wider arc than U-235. 5. Collect separated streams at different positions. The physics was straightforward. The engineering was nightmarish. The mass difference between U-235 and U-238 is less than 1%. Separating them required extraordinarily uniform magnetic fields across large volumes, hence the enormous magnets with silver windings. The name Calutron came from California University cyclotron, a tribute to Lawrence and UC Berkeley, where the technology was invented. A single calutron could separate tiny quantities of uranium. The Manhattan Project needed kilograms, enough for a bomb. The solution? Build hundreds of calutrons operating in parallel, arranged in giant ellipses called racetracks. 2 sizes were constructed. Alpha calutrons, larger machines, produced partially enriched uranium, boosting U-235 content from 0.7% to approximately 10 to 20%. Beta calutrons, smaller machines, further enriched alpha output to weapons-grade 80% purity. Each alpha racetrack building contained 96 calutron units arranged in 2 ovals. The completed Y-12 complex eventually included 9 alpha racetracks with 864 calutrons, 6 beta racetracks with 216 calutrons, total 1,152 calutrons operating simultaneously. Construction of the first Alpha building began February 18, 1943, before the design was even finalized and while the first load of silver coils was being shipped from Milwaukee. The timeline was insane. Groundbreaking to first operation took only 9 months. But that first startup on November 13, 1943, ended in disaster. The first Alpha track powered up on November 13, 1943. Within hours, catastrophe struck. The massive magnetic windings shorted out. Electrical arcs jumped between coils. Insulation failed. The entire system shut down. Investigation revealed 2 critical errors. First, the magnetic coils were positioned too close together. The intense magnetic fields interacted, creating stresses the insulation couldn't withstand. Second, the insulating oil was contaminated with organic material. Under electrical stress, the contamination caused breakdown and short circuits. The implications were devastating. The entire Manhattan Project schedule depended on Y-12 producing enriched uranium. If electromagnetic separation failed, the bomb program might collapse. All 80 Alpha I magnets had to be disassembled, shipped back to Alice Chalmers in Milwaukee, rebuilt with proper spacing and clean insulation, then returned to Oak Ridge and reinstalled. During this 3-month disaster, the Manhattan Project essentially stopped. The race with Germany, which everyone assumed was also building atomic weapons, seemed lost. If the Germans succeeded first? The rebuilt magnets were reinstalled. The second Alpha track entered service January 22, 1944. The rebuilt first track restarted March 3, 1944. Operation resumed, though with persistent technical problems. At the Berkeley laboratory, Ernest Lawrence's cyclotrons were operated exclusively by PhD physicists, highly trained scientists who understood the complex physics and electrical engineering involved. Oak Ridge couldn't possibly staff 1,152 calutrons with PhDs. The wartime labor shortage made even finding qualified engineers difficult. Yet the calutrons required constant monitoring and adjustment to optimize uranium collection. Tennessee Eastman Corporation, contracted to manage Y-12 operations, made a radical decision: recruit young women, mostly recent high school graduates, many from local farms. These Calutron girls received training at the University of Tennessee, then at Berkeley on a scale model, and finally at Oak Ridge on actual equipment. For security reasons, they were never told what they were producing, only that they were making some sort of catalyst that would be very important in the war. Each operator worked in a cubicle, monitoring instruments and adjusting control knobs to maximize output from one Calutron unit. The task required intense concentration, watching for subtle changes in meters, tweaking voltages and currents, maintaining optimal operating conditions. The surprising result? The women proved better operators than the PhD physicists. Oral histories from Manhattan Project veterans document this repeatedly. The PhDs constantly theorized about what should work, adjusting controls based on their understanding of physics. The young women simply watched the meters and adjusted knobs to maximize readings, like tuning an engine by ear rather than calculation. Theodore Rockwell, an engineer at Y-12, later recounted, "To the surprise of the scientists, the women operators did extraordinarily well, especially considering they were not told that they were separating isotopes of uranium. An analogy is the country kid who has an old Model T who doesn't know anything about engineering but can really tune up the engine." At peak operation, Y-12 employed 22,428 workers, with approximately 2,500 operators directly running calutrons. The Tennessee Eastman payroll ballooned from 10,000 in mid-1944 to over 22,000 by war's end. Operating calutrons was dangerous work, though not in ways most factory workers faced. The enormous magnets generated magnetic fields so intense they affected anything ferromagnetic within range. Workers learned to keep steel tools, watches, belt buckles, and other metal objects far from the equipment. One infamous incident, preserved in multiple oral histories, illustrates the hazard. Workers were moving a large steel plate near a calutron when it entered the magnetic field's influence. The plate shot toward the magnet, pinning a worker against the equipment like a butterfly. Supervisors ran to the control room. "Shut down the magnet, we've got to get him off." The response from project leadership was coldly pragmatic. "The war is killing 300 people an hour. If we shut down the magnet, it will take days to restabilize and get production back up. That's hundreds of lives. I'm not shutting it down. You'll have to pry him off with 2x4s. Which they did. Fortunately, the worker wasn't seriously injured. But the incident revealed the project's priorities. Uranium production mattered more than individual safety, because the atomic bomb might shorten the war and save lives overall. The vacuum tanks themselves required constant maintenance. The electromagnetic separation process was inefficient, only about 10% collection efficiency. Uranium ions that missed the collectors splattered against tank walls. Workers had to periodically open tanks and scrape uranium deposits off the walls, valuable material that couldn't be wasted. This recovery work was tedious and time-consuming, but necessary. Every gram of U-235 represented hours of operation and massive electrical consumption. The Y-12 plant consumed 238,000 kilowatts of electricity, nearly half the entire output of the Tennessee Valley Authority power system. To put this in perspective, the electromagnetic separation process alone used more electricity than many medium-sized cities. Add the K-25 gaseous diffusion plant requiring even more power and S-50 thermal diffusion, and Oak Ridge became one of the largest electricity consumers in the world. The TVA had been built in the 1930s as a New Deal project to bring electrical power to rural Tennessee. Its dams, Norris Dam, Watts Bar Dam, and Cherokee Dam, generated hydroelectric power for regional development. In 1942 to 1945, much of that power went to enriching uranium. Civilians in the region faced electricity rationing while the secret city behind the fence consumed power at unprecedented rates. The electrical load created technical challenges. The massive currents flowing through silver magnet windings generated enormous heat. Cooling systems ran constantly to prevent damage. The vacuum pumps maintaining near-perfect vacuums in calutron tanks required continuous operation. One technical assessment calculated that enriching 1 kilogram of U-235 required approximately 100,000 kilowatt-hours of electricity, enough to power a typical American home for nearly a decade. At today's electricity prices, that would represent roughly $10,000 worth of power per kilogram of enriched uranium. During wartime, with rationing and industrial priorities, the actual cost was irrelevant. Uranium production justified any expense. Despite persistent technical problems, the Y-12 calutrons gradually accumulated enriched uranium throughout 1944 and early 1945. The process was agonizingly slow. Each alpha calutron produced a few grams of partially enriched uranium per day. Beta calutrons, refining alpha output, produced even smaller quantities of weapons-grade material. By July 1945, Y-12 had produced approximately 50 kilograms of highly enriched U-235, enough for a single atomic bomb with some margin for testing and waste. This uranium was shipped to Los Alamos, New Mexico, where weapons designers under J. Robert Oppenheimer were assembling the Little Boy gun-type bomb. Little Boy's design was elegant. Fire one subcritical mass of U-235 into another using a conventional explosive charge. The combined mass exceeds critical threshold, initiating an exponential chain reaction, nuclear fission releasing energy equivalent to thousands of tons of TNT. On July 16, 1945, scientists at Los Alamos detonated Trinity, the first nuclear test, using plutonium from Hanford rather than Y-12 uranium. Trinity's success validated the basic weapons physics. But for the Hiroshima bomb, planners trusted Little Boy's simpler gun-type design. No test was conducted. The uranium was too precious to waste on a test that might fail. Little Boy would be combat tested on August 6, 1945, over Japan. At 8:15 a.m. local time on August 6, 1945, the B-29 bomber Enola Gay released Little Boy over Hiroshima, Japan. The bomb fell for 44 seconds. At an altitude of 1,968 feet, the altimeter-triggered firing mechanism activated. Uranium-235 from Y-12 underwent nuclear fission. The explosion released energy equivalent to 15,000 tons of TNT. The fireball reached temperatures exceeding 1 million degrees Celsius. The blast wave demolished everything within a 1-mile radius. Thermal radiation caused instant fires up to 3 miles away. Approximately 70,000 people died immediately. By the end of 1945, deaths from injuries and radiation reached approximately 140,000. 3 days later, on August 9th, a plutonium bomb from Hanford, not Y-12, destroyed Nagasaki. On August 15th, Japan announced surrender. When President Harry Truman revealed the atomic bomb's existence, Americans learned for the first time what Oak Ridge had been producing. The secret city's purpose was declassified. Workers who had operated calutrons without knowing what they were making finally understood. The Knoxville News-Sentinel front page on August 6, 1945, revealed, "Atomic bomb made at Oak Ridge strikes Japan." For the Calutron girls, the revelation was profound. They had been adjusting meters and turning knobs, making something they called a catalyst. Now they knew their work had produced the uranium that destroyed a city and ended a war. In December 1946, the War Department shut down most Y-12 Calutron operations. The K-25 gaseous diffusion plant had proven far more efficient than electromagnetic separation. While calutrons required enormous labor and energy to enrich uranium, gaseous diffusion operated continuously with minimal supervision, producing weapons-grade material faster and cheaper. The shutdown cost Oak Ridge over 20,000 jobs as workers were laid off. The boomtown shrank, though it would grow again during the Cold War. But a few calutrons remained operational, 36 units in the Beta 3 building and pilot units in Building 9731. These continued separating isotopes of elements other than uranium. The first post-war isotope separation began November 16, 1945, when Y-12 calutrons processed copper. Subsequently, calutrons separated isotopes of virtually every element in the periodic table, producing materials for medical research, nuclear physics experiments, and industrial applications. This continued until 1998, when cheaper isotope sources forced operations to close. Part of today's medical isotope shortage traces to this shutdown. The calutrons that once separated uranium for bombs later produced radioisotopes for cancer treatment. The silver, meanwhile, remained in Y-12 magnet windings. Some magnets were replaced with copper coils after 1946, but others, particularly in the pilot plant, operated with silver until 1970. The final return of Manhattan Project silver occurred on June 1, 1970, just weeks before General Leslie Groves died on July 13, 1970. Groves, who had commanded the Manhattan Project from 1942 to 1947, lived just long enough to see every ounce of borrowed silver returned to Treasury custody. The final accounting? 14,700 tons lent, 14,700 tons returned. Despite handling silver worth billions across decades of operations, not a single ounce was lost or stolen. Workers had drilled holes over paper, swept floors carefully, and tracked every shaving. The silver went back to West Point Bullion Depository, resuming its role in U.S. monetary reserves until the abandonment of silver backing for currency in the 1970s. By the time U-12 reached full operation in early 1945, the electromagnetic separation process was already obsolete. The K-25 gaseous diffusion plant had come online, proving vastly more efficient. Gaseous diffusion required fewer workers, less maintenance, and produced enriched uranium continuously rather than in small batches. The U-12s had one advantage. They could reach very high enrichment levels in a single pass. Gaseous diffusion required thousands of stages to reach weapons-grade purity. The optimal strategy combined methods: gaseous diffusion for initial enrichment, electromagnetic separation for final refinement. This hybrid approach was adopted in subsequent weapons production. But the irony remained. 14,700 tons of silver had been borrowed to build equipment that would be largely shuttered within 18 months of becoming operational. Was it worth it? Absolutely. The Manhattan Project succeeded because of redundancy, multiple parallel paths to atomic weapons, ensuring that failure of any single approach wouldn't halt the entire program. Colonel Kenneth Nichols, who had negotiated that silver loan in August 1942, later wrote, "Redundancy was at the heart of the Manhattan Project. Each of the uranium processes we built at the Clinton Engineer Works served as a backup for the others." U-12 produced the uranium for Little Boy. If gaseous diffusion had failed, electromagnetic separation would have been the only path to U-235. The silver investment purchased insurance against catastrophic failure. The 14,700 tons of silver borrowed from U.S. Treasury vaults made possible the Little Boy atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima, containing approximately 64 kilograms of Y-12 enriched uranium. Medical isotope production from 1945 to 1998, separating radioisotopes used in cancer treatment, diagnostic imaging, and biomedical research. Stable isotope separation for nuclear physics research, producing specialized materials for scientific experiments worldwide. Proof of concept that electromagnetic separation could work at industrial scale, establishing precedents for subsequent isotope separation technologies. The economic calculus is staggering. At today's silver prices, the 395 million troy ounces borrowed would be worth approximately $16 billion. The entire Manhattan Project cost about $2.2 billion, roughly $45 billion in 2024 dollars, not including the silver. But those calculations miss the point. The silver's value wasn't its monetary worth, but its electrical conductivity. No amount of money could have bought copper that didn't exist in 1942. Silver solved an impossible problem, building magnets powerful enough to separate uranium isotopes when the necessary copper wasn't available. On August 3, 1942, when Colonel Kenneth Nichols asked Undersecretary Daniel Bell for 6,000 tons of silver, neither man knew exactly how it would be used. The Manhattan Project was so secret that even cabinet-level officials weren't briefed on specifics. Bell agreed to lend the silver because President Roosevelt had authorized unlimited resources for atomic weapons. The "how many troy ounces" exchange became legend because it captured the clash between traditional Treasury accounting and unprecedented wartime urgency. The silver went from West Point to Milwaukee to Oak Ridge, wound into magnets that generated magnetic fields separating uranium isotopes atom by atom. Young women from Tennessee farms, trained to watch meters without understanding what they measured, operated equipment that transformed 0.7% U-235 uranium into 80% weapons-grade material. The process was inefficient, expensive, and obsolete within months of becoming operational, yet it worked, producing the uranium core for a bomb that destroyed a city and ended the deadliest war in human history. all made possible by borrowing America's silver reserve, transforming monetary metal into magnetic coils, and trusting farm girls to turn knobs they weren't told the purpose of. When the last silver returned to West Point in June 1970, the Manhattan Project had been declassified for 24 years. But the story of how Treasury silver built the atomic bomb remained obscure, overshadowed by tales of physicists, plutonium, and the Trinity test. Yet without that silver, there would have been no Y-12. Without Y-12, no uranium for Little Boy. Without Little Boy, who knows how long the Pacific War would have continued. Treasury silver didn't just enable atomic weapons, it demonstrated a principle that would define the Cold War. When national survival is at stake, nothing is too valuable to repurpose, no resource too precious to use. The silver that once backed American currency spent 3 decades wound into electromagnets, separating isotopes. Then it went back to being money, as if that interlude, when it helped split atoms and end a war, had never happened. But the atoms remember, and the historical record preserves the truth. America ran out of copper in 1942, so the Manhattan Project used Fort Knox silver. Well, technically West Point silver, but the principle remains: build the impossible by using whatever materials are available, measured in whatever units Treasury prefers, to achieve the unthinkable. 14,700 tons of silver, 395 million troy ounces, 1 atomic bomb, and a war won.